Hello viewers, I am Dr. Sanavar Soham from Kalindi College and I was discussing about the plant communities in the previous lecture. So now I will continue with the plant communities and classification given by Ronquier in understanding of a plant community. So we know that Ronquier gave a system in which plants were classified according to relationship of their height above the ground to the perinating organ. The organ that survives from one growth season to the next is referred to as the perinating organ. Now, it generally includes the embryonic or meristematic tissues of buds, bulbs, tubers, roots and seeds, as I have already discussed. So, we have 5 forms of plants that have been characterized accordingly. They are the phanerophytes, chemiophytes, hemicryptophytes, cryptophytes and therophytes. So let's move on to the understanding of phanerophytes. Phanerophytes are the perinating organs which include buds that are present on erect shoots present above the ground. The buds are naked and exposed to the external conditions. These include trees, shrubs and climbers that are present in the tropical climate. Then what are chemiophytes? They are the perinating organs that are present on shoots that are found close to or just above the ground. The buds receive protection from external environmental conditions via the fallen leaf and the snow cover, and these include creeping woody plants and herbs that are found in cool, dry climates, that is Arctic and alpine regions. Then third type is the hemicryptophytes. As we can see in the slide, the perinating organs are present near the ground and receive protection from fallen leaves and soil cover. These includes biennial and perennial herbs growing in rosettes. The plants are found in cold temperature zone and the aerial parts of the plants die on the onset of the unfavorable conditions. Now moving on to cryptophytes. They are the perinating organs or buds that are buried in the ground, that is, they are present under the soil cover. These buds are protected from freezing or drying. So these includes tubers or bulbs, herbs that are found mainly in the arid zones. Then therophytes. These are annual plants which complete their life cycle in summer or the favorable season. They complete their life cycle in a single season, say a few months. The seeds, which are the perinating organs, remain dormant during the unfavorable season. So these includes plants that are occurring in deserts and the grasslands. Now this slide shows, we can see the Ronquier's classification of perennial plant growth forms which are based on the location of the meristem related to the soil surface. So we can see, as I already discussed, this is the phanerophytes, which are taller trees and the buds are away from the soil surface. Here, these are the chemiophytes which have buds closer to the soil surface. Then moving on to the hemicryptophytes, they are tuberous. Basically, what happens is they are either just covered with the soil surface or very near to the soil surface. And lastly, we can see the cryptophytes where they are basically the arid plants. They are the buds, they are embedded inside the soil. So this diagram shows the Ronquier's classification and the classification in the plants according to the soil surface. Now, the relative proportion of different types of vegetations tell us about the climatic condition prevalent in that area. Phanerophytes generally comprise 60 to 90% of the flora of the humid regions. The hemicryptophytes occupy around 50% of the cool temperate regions. Now, this slide shows basically we can see this is a pie diagram and it shows the presence of therophytes, the chemiophytes, hemicryptophytes, therophytes according to the vegetation and the percentage they are present in a particular community. Now moving on to the next attribute, which is sociability. Sociability refers to the nature of grouping of individual plants that grow singly, in patches, in colonies or even intermixed. This feature depends upon the life form, its vigor its habitat, the competition between the species, and the relationship with the individuals which are present in that community. It represents degree of association between the species. Now, the plants have been characterized into 5 groups depending upon their sociability, which are known as the sociability classes, and they are designated as S1 to S5. So, when we discuss about the S1, you can see S1 are the plants that are found separately from each other, that is, they grow singly. S2 are the plants that are in group of 4 to 6, they are growing together in a place. S3 is a small group of plants that are growing at a place, the number is more than 5. And in S4, the sociability factor 4, the big group of plants that are growing at a place, and S5 is the one where large number of plants, they occupy area and they interact with each other. So, depending upon all these factors, the sociability factor and the vitality, vigor, life forms, we are able to make a better understanding of a community. All these which we discussed were the qualitative characteristics. Now, we will move on to the quantitative characteristics. When we talk about the quantitative characteristics, they are the measurable characteristics, and we can understand these community, and these include parameters that can be measured or counted for better understanding of a community. The first attribute or the first aspect is population density. Now, what is a population density? It depicts number of individuals of a particular species in a unit represented numerical strength of a community. Now, by measuring the parameter, we can have an idea about the abundance of a species. It also gives us information about the degree of competition between the number of species, and it is expressed as number of individuals per unit area. We can calculate this by using this formula. The formula as shown in the slide is density, where density can be calculated by number of individuals of a species in all the sampling units divided by total number of individuals of sampling unit study. So, by understanding or counting the number of individuals in all the sampling units and dividing it with the total number of sampling units studied, we can find out the density of a particular species. Now, ecological density is density of individuals of a species calculated for a place of their frequent occurrence. So, it is a measure which is very important in understanding of a community. Now, moving on to the second aspect, its cover or the herbage cover. It refers to the area of the ground which is occupied by leaves, stems and inflorescence, that is above ground parts of the plant. Now, each layer of vegetation is considered separately. The overlapping units are also considered. The tall vegetation is rated separately from those growing under it. So, the basal area refers to the ground penetrated by the stem, that is the portion of the plant that grows into soil. Now, in this diagram, we can see this is basically the coverage area. This is a tree, these are small herbs, shrubs, and this is the coverage area. And the coverage area can be demarcated by this, and this is where the plant is coming and is basically embedded in the soil, is called the basal area. So, we find out the canopy, the coverage area of different plants, and we can then discuss about the community. So, foliage cover is the soil surface covered with the leaves. When the herbage cover forms a continuous cover, it is said to be closed. When the vegetation cover has gaps, that is, it gets colonized by individuals, it is said to be open. So, if the space between the vegetation is more, it is considered to be sparse. Now, herbage cover is very important in study of vegetation. Why? It helps in understanding the nature of the community and evaluating the quantitative relationships between the species. Information about the herbage cover tells about the changing trends of the community. So, by herbage cover or the quantitative character, we can very well discuss the qualitative character, that is the changing trends of the community. Now moving on to the next aspect, the plant height. The height of a plant is a good indicator of the performance of vegetation. It is also referred to as stratification. It tells us about the success of a species in various habitats. Now, it indicates the presence of favorable environmental conditions, and stratification results in upper strata or canopy which receives higher proportion of light. Obviously, the top part or the upper part of the canopy will receive higher because it is exposed to sunlight. A variation in plant structure and stratification within a community leads to stratification of the environment. Now moving on to the weight of plants or the biomass, how they attribute or how they help in understanding of the qualitative aspects of the community, the plant communities. Now it is one of the important quantitative feature of the plant. It gives us an idea about the growth. It is generally expressed in the form of dry weight of the plants. Now the biomass or the weight can be measured separately for the above ground parts such as stem, leaves, fruits and flowers, and below ground parts such as roots. It is measured after drying the plant at 80 degrees for 2 days. The data gives us valuable information about the yield of the species, also known as the forage. Now, till now we have discussed about the analytical characters for understanding of the plant community. Now we will move on to the synthetic characters. So first and foremost we will discuss the presence and constancy of a species. What is it? It refers to the presence of different strands of a species in the uniformity. For example, if a species is present in 15 strands out of 20, the presence or the constancy is 75%. The term constancy is used when equal measured sample areas are used for the study. Term presence is used when the area of sampling unit varies from strand to strand. Now, species in a community can be classified into 5 classes of constancy according to their periodicity, that is the occurrence of sampling units or strands. In this slide you can see these are the classes. Now class 1 shows 1 to 20% of the sampling unit of the community. Class 2 shows the presence of 21 to 40% of the sampling units of the community. Class 3 shows 41 to 60%. Moving on to class 4, 61 to 80% of the sampling units, and class 5 that represents the 81 to 100% of the sampling units of community. Now class 4 and 5 include species that occur in large number of strands. The species that occur in over 80 to 90% or more number of strands or the sampling units, they are known as constant species. Now these species are the characteristic of a community and help in distinguishing our community. That is, the species which belong to these classes, classes 4 and 5, have a wide ecological amplitude and are capable of growing in the micro habitats. Now, we move on to the next character, the dominance, which represents the presence of species in high numbers of community. Now, this could be due to the presence of favorable conditions or its capacity to tolerate wide range of ecological conditions. The population of other species is reduced in number and vitality. So, cover and population density are chief characters which determine the dominance of a species. The dominant species possess the capacity to alter the microhabitat for that particular species. Now, this gives them the chance to grow in wide range of environmental conditions. For example, cynodon is a dominant species occurring in pastures and grasslands. It possesses excellent vitality, rapid rate of multiplication and growth and deep root system. So, moving on to the frequency, the degree or spread distribution of an individual species present in area is called dispersion. It describes the structure of the ecological community. Now, there are 3 basic patterns of dispersion. These includes random dispersion, uniform or regular dispersion, or clumped contagious dispersion. It is usually expressed as percentage. It can be studied by sampling the study area randomly at different intervals. Now, this slide shows how we calculate the frequency of a particular species. For calculating the frequency, we find out the number of sampling units in which species occur upon the total number of sampling units studied, and as it's a percentage, so we multiply it with 100. So, Ronke recognized 6 frequency classes in natural vegetation. Class A, as you can see in the slide, the plants showing frequency distribution of 0 to 20%. Class B, where the plants show frequency distribution of 21 to 40%. Class C, where the plants show frequency distribution of 41 to 60%. And Class D, plants showing frequency distribution of 61 to 80%. Class E, showing frequency distribution of 81 to 100%. Suppose a species occurs in 5 sampling units out of 20, then its frequency is 25%. A species that is uniformly spread over an area will show frequency of about 10%, because obviously it is more in number and it is showing its presence in all the sampling units which are present in a community. In contrast, a poorly dispersed species with large number of individuals aggregated at one place will show low frequency. So, a high frequency shows greater uniformity and dispersion, and frequency of a species relative to other species in a community is referred to as relative frequency. How do we calculate relative frequency? In the slide, you can see the relative frequency is calculated by knowing the frequency of a species, dividing it by the total frequency of all the species into 100. So, moving on to importance value index IVI. Now, in a community, the parameters such as density, frequency, cover, and patterns have their own importance. Each parameter determines a specific feature. For example, frequency tells us about the dispersion of a species over an area. Density gives us an idea about the numerical strength of a species present in a community. And the ecological importance of a species in a community can be assessed by studying the parameters such as relative frequency, relative density, and relative abundance, which we have already discussed. So, these values are further added to get 300 value, which is considered as the importance value index or IVI of the species. This value is represented diagrammatically. A circle is drawn and is divided into 4 equal quarters by drawing 2 line segments at right angles to each other, passing through the center. Now, each of 3 radii is divided into 100 parts from the center to the circumference, and the 4th one into 300 divisions. Now, 0 to 100 scales are marked, and the value of relative frequency on A, relative density on B, and relative dominance on C, and the IVI values are plotted on D. All these points are joined. Such illustrations help us to provide a sociological features and IVI of a species. This IVI gives the composite picture of a sociological status of a species in a community. Now, in this slide, you can see this is the diagrammatic representation of relative density for the species. Now, we can see, as I already discussed, we have marked, we plot a circle, and the markings on 3 sides is up to 100, and the 4th side, which tells us about the IVI, is up to 300. So, relative frequency, relative density, relative dominance is plotted on A, B and C, and then IVI is marked on the D, and we come to know, with this diagram, we come to know about the sociability, about the occurrence of a species, and consolidated discussion can be made on the presence of a species in an area. Now, let's move on to the species diversity. It is one of the most important characteristics of the community. It is measured by counting the number of species present in a given area. It can be easily calculated for a plant species. More time is required to calculate species diversity for wider areas, such as forests. Why? Because it's an elaborate area. It requires elaborate study that has to be undertaken to determine the exact value of species diversity. Now, we will focus on the large scale changes that occur in a community with the passage of time. We all know that community, they are stabilized, but there are changes, continuous changes that are happening in a community. These changes are referred to as ecological succession. The ecosystems, they are dynamic entities in which a large number of events they take place. The biotic communities, they present in an ecosystem undergo changes with time. These changes can occur naturally or they can be induced by the man. The changes can be short term or long term. The long term changes permanently change the characteristic organization composition of a particular ecosystem. And the long term changes are caused by natural events such as volcanic eruptions, landslides, floods, hurricanes and human interventions such as mining, deforestation, etc. All these changes, they alter the community structure to a significant extent. The species present in a habitat, they change with the passage of time, and many new species invade the area with the passage of time. So, we will now discuss the succession in communities. We just discussed how to know about or how to understand a community with various analytical synthetic characteristics by understanding of how we can find out the IVI. Now we will move on to understanding of how communities establish themselves or the succession happens in plant communities. Now the new species can develop into a community with the passage of time. One community replaces the other until a stable, mature community develops in that particular area. So what is succession? The changes in the environmental conditions, they affect the ecosystem considerably. The structure of community changes considerably by replacing one species by another species which develop in the area over the period of time. Now within any community, some species become less abundant or disappear over the period of time. Some species within a community become more abundant or new species invade into new community from adjacent ecosystems over the time. So the process of change in the species structure over the time is termed as succession, and the change in the composition of a species of an ecological community of an ecosystem recorded or observed in an interval of time is referred to as ecological succession. Now, according to Odum, plant succession can be defined as an orderly process of community change. Now, succession can be defined as a directional, non-seasonal change in the species composition of an area with passage of time, and it involves various stages such as colonization, establishment and extension. A set of environmental conditions is required for the optimum growth and reproduction of a species. In a given ecosystem, species can grow most efficiently and produce viable offsprings. They become abundant with time because of favorable environmental conditions. The species flourish till the environmental conditions remain constant. Under the change of environmental conditions, the survival of dominant species get affected and the other species appear in the area. Now, each stage of ecological succession takes a few years or a few hundred years. Ecological succession may also occur when environmental conditions change drastically, say for case of forest fires or windstorms, say anthropogenic activities such as agriculture alter the conditions of environment to a great extent. Now these massive forces, they destroy species and thus alter the dynamics of the ecological community. the survival of the dominant species gets affected and the process of succession begins in an area partially or completely devoid of vegetation because of a disturbance such as fires, windstorms and volcanic eruptions, climatic changes, severe flooding, say disease or pest infestation, etc. Succession stops when the species composition does not change with passage of time. The community present at that point of time is referred to as the climax community. The establishment of the climax community provides stability to the community and the region remains in an equilibrium within an ecosystem. So the concept of succession was given by Clements. Some species become dominant because of their size, abundance and ability to compete successfully with associated species. The presence of a particular dominant species, usually referred as pioneer community, consisting of different groups of plants, invades the community and eventually replaces the original colonizers. The climatic and topographic changes bring marked changes in community structure over a period of time, and this affects the association of plants with other species. The succession may be rapid or extended over many years until stability is attained through an establishment of vegetation. So, in the next lecture, we will discuss ecological succession in details, the different types of succession that happens in the ecological community and how a climax community is established in various steps. Thank you.